This should be me glazing Glaivewraith Stalkers using just water, calling it water glazing. I recorded this last November. It's May. The rest of the video was finished in April, last night, and the recording was all done in November. So I'm trying to make this because
It's July now. I'm almost done with this video.
let's plan out what color scheme we're using before undercoating. I brought this up as a reference. This is basically the scheme I'm going for, but he'll have a skull-looking skull. It's little leaves. This one's got stone with leaves on it. Oh, and some vines. This sort of leadery-looking guy's got a big piece of stone with metal on it. I guess this guy's got metal on him as well. So this guy doesn't have metal, and he doesn't have a crow. He's got a rose. This guy's base looks like the simplest. This is my guy for tonight. This is going to be a glazably thin coat of Mechanis Standard Gray over these stones on the base. This gray will be thin enough that those hard-to-see highlights are still visible despite being covered in gray. And there we have it. The Mechanis Standard Gray is on the base. It's really flattened that stone. The stone is almost entirely the same color. So that just makes it look better. It looks better as standard gray than it does as just primed. It's at this point the fact that I over-primed these with my light gray is obvious. I should have used diluted light gray. This is important because now I definitely want this Mechanis gray on here to solidify what's the stone and what's unfinished. If not just for me, then for whatever result I end up with. So I'm really just using these base paints to make up a glaze. To do that, take the base paint and some water and then just mix them. It's not the most obvious thing, it's also not very hard. But I'm always doing it with the tip of the brush. So I'll have on my palette a little blob of base paint and a little blob of water. I'll dip the brush in one of them and put it somewhere in the middle, and dip the brush in the other one and put it somewhere in the middle, and scribble it together. A picture's worth 1,000 words. Here's how I do it with this dryad bark that I'm going to then put on the roots. So if you can ignore whatever horror movie that was playing in the background, you'll see that I'm really only mixing what's on the tip of the brush into a glaze for this. I've already loaded a whole bunch of paint onto the palette. I don't need to worry about getting that anywhere anytime soon. It's a wet palette. It's not drying out. It's staying there. So I just need to get just a little on the tip and then a little in the mix together into the right consistency. And judging the right consistency is hard, but I didn't realize it was hard until after about a month, because I'd already adopted this process and I couldn't put into words exactly where the goal consistency was. I could just say, this is how I get there. Here is the dryad bark glazed over the roots on the base. And that's the brown. That's the brown on the base. And with that, I think it's time to do the Agrax Earth Shade and the Nuln Oil shades in order to bring out those cracks. So the Earth Shade is really just to shade the cracks that are going to be filled with dirt. What do you know? What is that movie? My lack of formal training in this is showing through. I don't want to think about the little blobs of dirt on the base. I'm throwing Agrax Earthshade on them, make them look earthy. Whatever. It's done. Let's put Nuln Oil on the stone to give it a little more definition. So the Nuln Oil has shifted the tone again. It's a little darker. It's a little better defined, I think. And I'm happy to leave it like that. So now on to the... What are we on to? We're on to the next part. Guns, prayers, monsters. Last November I was watching Priests, was on Amazon. That's it for the simpler stuff on the base. I want to wait until everything's done before I start spreading uncut, opaque, and dryad bark around that base. The red rose petals on the base I'm going to leave until I've got everything else other than the red rose petals and the rim done. So the only other element on this base is the bones. Bones also share texture with the skull. Let's do them next. I found the texture tool easy way to load paint onto my palette. You don't need to see me paint it. How to make it into a glaze. It looks a little bit better here than on those teeny tiny roots. Not that my camera skills have captured that. I promise I'm trying to get better at this. And there we have the Baneblade Brown on that small hand, the skull, and the horse face. Now, it's a very thin coat, so it's almost looks like a trick of the light. Once it's shaded, it'll take a much more aggressive tone. If you're not comfortable with this sort of approach, feel free to paint it on as thickly as you would like. Like a peasant. I lied. We're doing the red roses now. And there's the red petals done. Now the paint is put on very thin, so some of the details should still show through, but because red is such a hard color to get coverage on, it took several layers to get this vibrancy. So the underpainting is somewhat lost as well, admittedly. Well, since the red took so long, that probably means the Baneblade's dry enough to apply a coat of Reichland Flesh Shade. I'm using Reichland Flesh Shade to wash the bones. I like the idea of washing bones with an organic shade. Let's look at the results of fully washed bones next to it just underpainted pier of this. You can clearly see the effect it's happening. It's subtle, but it's there. In my mind, a glaze and a wash are both verbs and nouns. This next clip is the black glaze. Screaming in tide marks! But yeah, that's the black done. So the next thing I want to do, beige on the shaft, since I'll have to wash it and I'll need it to be dry to do that. I think that the tide marks could have been avoided by using something like a glaze medium that would avoid breaking the paint down, or not really looking forward to painting those, which are more Glaivewraith Stalkers. Look at that watered down coverage. Next is going to be the bronze on the blade. I'm using Balthasar gold instead of lead belt. Let's see what how that looks. That is the glaive painted with thinned Balthasar gold. The thinning means you get this weird unsteady color that I'm quite fond of. Because there's enough water that the pigment and junk is moving around and drying in an unsteady way. Luckily, it still looks good. That's the wash. And now I've got to wait for the wash to dry. I'm going to paint the base. I do not remember what I was thinking when I was doing this. So that's the rim of the base with dryad bark. This really is the only time when you don't need to get a good consistency for your paint. You should still thin it. I still thin it. You want it to dry smooth and even rather than the landlord's special. And I mean that even without taking into account his ethical removal of fascism. In the foreground, you can see my clipped paint bottle. You can hear me deliberating on how to apply the oxide compound. I think this is technically supposed to be a glaze, but if you try asking that on Facebook, people are legally obliged to inform you it's not a glaze. You apply it to make metals look rusty. It doesn't clarify whether or not the paint itself is a glaze as a noun. Almost there. Last step. Blue. We're going to glaze blue along the bottom of the robes. We're going to water it down. We're going to smoothly rub it all over the place. It's going to look good. It's going to look good. It's going to look good. You want to see how it looks? Because it looks good. And there you have it. A glazed glaive spirit thing. Basically every Jewish holiday can be. But how's that look on a sort of battlefield made of coffee grinds and old Games Workshop sand?
Yes. To be honest, it still kind of does, but here we are. I talked about Judaism in this video because that's what I know. That's what I've spent years researching and experiencing and learning about. But the process of racialization, letting groups assimilate or making them other, that's not unique to Judaism at all. And the levels of Islamophobia across the world are a fucking nightmare. And the way people talk about it, how immigration bans are...
Hope you liked this. I'm gonna go to bed. Like or dislike this video at your likingest convenience to engage with a comment or a share. Write an opinion. Write an opinion down there. Write it now.